Who is gonna win this among the two, like ChatGPT or Google?
I don't think ChatGPT alone would have been able to beat Google, but now that they are integrated with Microsoft, they do have a chance. I think if Google really goes all in on it, I think it will still win.
Hey Shikhar, what's up, man? Welcome to the Mike and Shots podcast once again, bro.
Hi Divyansh, thanks for inviting me again. So good to talk to you after such a long time, man.
Yeah, it's been a while, yeah, and since the time we talked last, there's been so much happening, especially in the AI space, and tech is just going crazy with AI and ChatGPT, and now Google Bard is
Yeah.
out, and things are going to change really fast. So I'm here with you to talk about all that. Kind of deep dive into the tech part, kind of deep dive into the industry bit and the
Hmm.
sentiment behind what is what's happening in the AI space and how everybody's so excited and fearful to some extent as well, because you can't predict what AI will do like in the next 3, 4, 5 years, probably, and how it may just change its nature. As I read on the internet about these things, some statements by Sam Altman, who founded OpenAI. So yeah, exciting things happening. So Shikhar, man, over to you. I before we begin this, episode, talk more about ChatGPT and Google Bard and all that.
Yeah.
I would like you to talk a little bit more about you again, because you're doing some
Yeah.
crazy stuff again on AI, and then we'll move forward.
So I did my bachelor's in computer science from Delhi College of Engineering back in 2014. I then spent a couple of years in Japan as a software developer. I came back to India. I was involved in another startup in logistics for about 7, 8 months. After that, I moved to the US for my master's. I did my master's in computer science machine learning. I then went on to join a company called Deca, who until recently were building an autonomous last delivery robot for FedEx. With the idea being that the bot can, instead of not just being able to drive on the road, would also be able to drive on the sidewalks and therefore be able to deliver stuff to people's home directly. After that, I left Deca in 2020, came back to India. I started my own startup called Mindkosh AI, built around data engineering and the practice of what we like to call good data and not big data. And that's what I've been trying to speak at conferences as well, this idea of good data and not bad data, where a lot of the times when startups and companies try to work on AI, they try to get as much data as they want. And the thing is, it's not just enough to have a lot of data, and sometimes you can even make do with a small amount of data. It's just that the data has to be very good, and
Hmm.
I think there's a lack of understanding of what good data means and the
Okay.
practices that you have to follow in order to make your data good. So we are
Hmm.
essentially building tools and we're using techniques like active learning, etc., that can reduce the amount of data that you use, and then also practices, general guidelines on how to create proper data sets for use.
Interesting, man. You talked about good data and bad data, and I
Yeah,
have no clue about like what exactly good data is or what exactly bad data is. And probably you also
yeah,
define some parameters to gauge like what is good and what is bad about data. But in for
yeah.
say a completely new person who is like very new to tech or doesn't know too much about tech and data, how do you like in one line or two lines define good data or define bad data like in terms of tech?
So there are a few key things that we like to focus on. Number one is that the data is properly structured. So for images, for example, that would mean that you don't have blurry images, your camera is not blurred. These are the basic things that probably people already know about. But then there's also the concept of properly labeling your data, which means that your data is consistently labeled.
Hmm.
So for example, if you have 100,000 images of, let's say, faces, then it means that the different number of labelers who are actually labeling the images, they're labeling the faces in a consistent manner. Maybe the
Hmm.
bounding boxes or the rectangles are not too loose and not too tight. If you want them to be loose, then it has to be loose across the data set. If you want it to be tight, it has to be tight across the data set.
All
Right.
right.
So that's the part of labeling. Then there's the idea of covering enough diversity in your data set to cover your use case. So for
Hmm.
example, if you want to talk about facial recognition, you want to have diversity in the people who are involved in your data set, right?
Okay.
So if you don't have people of Asian heritage, you won't be able to identify people of Asian heritage
Correct.
properly,
Yeah.
right? So that's the data diversity that we talk about. In images, it can be sometimes a little bit easier. It becomes a little bit more difficult when you talk about speech, for example, where you can have
Hmm.
different dialects and different ways of speaking. Some people speak in different ways. Some people stop and speak. Some people speak very regularly, right?
Yeah.
And they have different dialects, especially in India. You walk 10 kilometers, the dialect changes. So
Hmm.
it's important to have diversity in that in your data set. For example, if you're building speech recognition. And then finally, there's the concept of edge cases, which
Hmm.
are scenarios that very rarely occur. But when they do occur, your system is not able to handle it. So, for example, let's say that there's a bus, and there's a car drawn on the bus. There's a picture of a car on the bus. Now, how would an autonomous system react to this situation? Because the
Hmm.
car is not actually there, but it's drawn and it's big. So an autonomous system could be tripped by that.
Okay.
Or there was a very famous use case in the autonomous driving community where there was this restaurant whose logo was very similar to the stop sign that is used in the US.
Okay.
And an autonomous car used to stop by that place because it used to think there's a stop sign here, right? So it used to stop on the way
Yeah. Yeah.
onto that place. So these are edge cases, and they happen in every use case that
Hmm.
you can
Hmm.
think of. So it's important to figure out those use cases and then include data for those use cases in your data set.
And that probably requires, first collecting the data like at your end.
Right.
You have to like predict that this kind of data is going to be, fed into the model or the tech,
Yeah.
and then train it. Okay, from that, I think some interesting tech stuff we started with. How do you think has tech evolved from say 2015 when OpenAI like kick started out to today,
Yeah.
which is like it's only been 8 years since OpenAI kick started, and we've seen so much happening in the last 5 6 months only. How do you think as tech and the industry evolved and the world evolved? Like what is your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think number one thing, everybody's trying to include AI into their systems. Every big company, every small company is trying to do it. I was recently at this conference around natural language processing, and everybody, even in the banking and finance sector, these are sectors that are very, very slow to adopt new technology. And
Hmm.
even they are trying to include AI in some way. People who previously had no idea about AI are now trying to
Hmm.
integrate AI into their companies. And the thing is that I think we're still very early in this AI revolution. We've seen AI everywhere. We see people talking about it everywhere. And yet, if you look around, apart from ChatGPT, there's really no killer app for AI that you can point to
Yes.
and say, yeah, this is AI. Maybe
Yes.
you can talk about Siri a little bit, but even that is not like Siri that doesn't work flawlessly. Chat GPT is probably the first thing that's
Hmm.
really brought attention for AI. Like this is the
Yeah.
first time that people are actually realizing what can happen with AI. And that's why
Hmm.
I think we're still very early. We're still, I would say, in the beginning stages of AI, and there's a lot more to come.
Hmm. Super interesting, because I was wondering that, since ChatGPT is here, Google is also now here, Bard
Yeah.
is here. Will this kind of accelerate the development in AI as it's already happening, like with other players? Or people will still, kind of experiment with AI first and then see what is going to happen and then probably move forward? What do you think? And even for startups like who
Yeah.
are already into AI, probably your company and similar companies, now will they accelerate that development or will do something, probably to propel themselves forward in this AI race?
I think there are a couple of things. Number one is if you talk about ChatGPT, fundamentally on the research side, it hasn't done something revolutionary. It hasn't really done something new. This has been built upon, and actually, you were talking about transformers earlier, which is the very basic building unit of this. It was Google came up with transformers in 2017, which was 6 years ago, right? So this has been building, and it has been built by a number of different organizations. What ChatGPT has done very well is that it has put it in a very well engineered product, and it has put out something that actually works and that people can interact with, and
Hmm.
people from every sphere can interact with. This is no
Hmm.
longer something that only applies to a few people. Everybody can use ChatGPT for whatever purposes they want, which is why it has such a higher reach. And what this is going to do, I think, is number one, it is going to spur companies like Google and the big tech people to jump into AI. It's not like their research is going to multiply. They probably already have a lot of these things internally that they were working on. It's just going to accelerate the release of those things. And I
Hmm.
also think that it's going to inspire other people who were already investing in AI to be a little bit uh, less fearful of what can
Hmm.
happen and just release stuff.
Okay.
And it will inspire them to do something more. So in that respect, I think this is going to really, again, as I mentioned, this is the probably the first use case of like a really impressive use case of AI. It's going to convince a lot of people at big
Hmm.
tech to really give AI a shot.
You said the word fear just right now.
Yeah.
When you said fear, did you mean that when people were like releasing AI products, were they fearing that AI would definitely go wrong, something will bad will happen like with the world, stuff like that? Or is it something else when you
Oh
say
no,
fear?
no, people are not that good in general.
Okay.
um, I think it's more that, as I said, we're still early in the AI age, right? If you think back to the mid 90s when we were probably at a similar stage in the internet revolution, right? There were not very clear-cut use cases of how internet would actually transform into the real, like into products. It was difficult to put things into production. Putting up a website was difficult. It's similar to how ML systems are today. It's not that easy to put ML systems into production. It's not that easy to keep them because even after you put something in production, you have to keep improving on the model, keep
Hmm.
feeding it new data, and to keep up with the changes around the world. And doing that requires expertise that is still not as much available in the world as the community requires. And what that
Hmm.
translates into is that number one, there's a lack of clear workflow on how to actually release these products. And second is how do you package these products so that they actually work? Because
Oh.
again, a lot
Hmm.
of these companies are probably working on products that they already have internalized. So they use these things internally. Because in those cases, even if a system doesn't work, in some cases it's fine. But when you release it out to the public, you really have to be sure on what will work and what will not work. And releasing AI based products is expensive. You require expensive GPUs, you require expensive
Yeah.
hardware.
Yeah.
So it costs a lot of money. So it can at times backfire if you release an unprepared product, for example, out in
Okay.
the real world. So I think that's where there's a little bit of an apprehension, at least there was until now, for releasing AI products quickly from big tech at
Hmm.
least.
Yeah, from big tech. I mean, because you said big tech, tell me one thing that, since big tech is playing big on AI now, essentially these language
Yeah.
models, is it going to benefit the other players, smaller players, or is it going to be detrimental to them? Because, big tech kind of takes up a huge chunk of things in the market, like they eat up the market in their own way. Like, do you think that's going to happen, but it's going to be beneficial for startups or other companies, smaller ones?
I think it's if you look at the current way in which systems are trained and then put into production, it's very expensive. So if a startup wanted to do something in AI today, it's not that easy,
Hmm.
and it's not cheap to get into AI if you really want to make systems that work. And that is not going to change at least in the next 5 to 6 years.
Okay.
But what these companies getting into will help with is because these are going to also open their APIs for others to use.
Yeah.
So it might be a little bit expensive for you to use the AIs versus if you had them internalized, but it's also safe in the sense that you don't have to worry about a huge upfront investment in that. So instead of investing millions of dollars in training a GPT-like model, you can now simply use their AI, and if it works very well, then you can consider something like training your own model. But otherwise, you can still keep using their API for testing and for the initial stages of your product at least.
Hmm.
And you don't have to have expertise in AI. That's one of the bigger things as well. You
Yeah.
don't have to have machine learning engineers anymore. If these APIs are available for all of the products, you don't need to have machine learning engineers anymore. You can
Yes.
simply use their APIs, and you can use simple, backend engineers can do the job.
So does that mean that you said that probably people may not need ML engineers and ML developers probably going
Yeah.
forward. So does this undermine their value in any way, or this is just one scenario you're talking about? What do you think about the
No,
ML engineers?
no. I think the value is only going to increase. It's just that the use cases are going to be more than they are today. but you're not going to have an API for everything. There are
Yeah.
only going to be APIs for a very small number of use cases. For example, you have APIs for things like classification and object detection from Facebook. So not from Facebook, but from Google and from Microsoft. You already have a lot of APIs
Hmm.
for doing classification and for object detection, but they don't work in every use case, right?
Yeah.
That's the one thing.
Yeah.
So one of the key things that actually OpenAI is trying to do is trying to change that. So we are probably going to talk about AGI at some point, but
Yes.
the idea with AGI was that you don't have to train your systems for specific tasks,
Got it.
which is the current paradigm, which is what we call weak AI essentially.
Weak
Um,
AI. Okay.
yeah, so weak AI is essentially expert systems which only work for the task that they are trained for. So if it's a speech
Right.
recognition model, it is only going to recognize speech. It cannot do anything else. But a general intelligence is something that's capable of doing a lot more than that because it's generally intelligent.
Hmm.
It doesn't have a weak concept of intelligence. So that's where the idea of weak AI and strong AI comes in. And strong AI is your AGI. So until AGI comes in, this is going to be the paradigm that you have a system that you have to train or you have to prepare for your own use case. And until that happens, you will need machine learning engineers for doing all of the data work and all of the training and all of the putting into production, etc. APIs again will only be available for a very small number of use cases, right? So for all the other use cases, you will still need machine learning engineers.
Hmm. Interesting. And from that, I would like to now move towards Chat GPT and the language models which are trending right now in the world and kind of creating a dent for a lot of the folks like out there. Right. So,
Yeah,
like, what is Chat GPT and what is Google Bard? Like, what are
yeah.
they in terms of AI and tech? What is it?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned earlier in 2017, Google came up with the idea of transformers.
Hmm.
So I won't go too deep into it, but essentially, before transformers came into existence, there was this concept of processing sequential data. And sequential data can be speech, it can be text. We used to process these things sequentially. So if you had a sentence, you would process one token. Token is a word essentially. So you process one token, then you take in the next token. Maybe you can have a context of the previous word and the next word, but when you're processing one word, you don't really have the context of the entire sentence. So you're processing one token independent of the other tokens, essentially. And what transformers did was that they allowed these systems to process the entire sentence at once. So if you are processing one word, you have the context of the entire sentence with you, which
Okay.
obviously works much better. So that was the core idea behind transformers. After transformers came the idea of large language models, which all of these GPTs and lambdas, all of these models are essentially large language models.
Hmm.
That concept is a very broad concept. So, but all of these LLMs or large language models have two things common. One is that they are all based on transformers,
Okay.
and number two, the idea there is not to train these models for any specific task.
Okay.
So these are general pre-trained tasks,
Okay.
models, which
Okay.
means
Okay.
that these are models that are good at understanding language, but they are
Hmm.
not trained to do any one thing. And the
Okay.
idea is that you can have these models ready or pre-trained, and then when
Hmm.
somebody wants to do something specific, they can fine tune the model to their requirement instead of
Okay.
training it from scratch. So that was
Okay.
the idea behind LLMs. Now, GPT is an LLM that was released by OpenAI in I think 2018 for the first
Hmm.
time. And GPT was a huge model. I think it involved around 175 billion parameters in the model. And
Okay.
at the time, probably still is the biggest AI model ever trained.
Okay.
And the idea there was similar to what LLMs are all about. It's just that it was trained on a huge amount of data. It was trained on, I
Hmm.
think, 500 billion words
Okay.
that were crawled from the internet. And what they saw with GPT, so GPT-1, GPT-2, GPT-3, what they saw with GPT-3, which is what ChatGPT is based on, with GPT-3, they saw that it was very good at understanding and producing language. But again, because it wasn't trained for any specific tasks, you had to coerce it into doing something for it. So, for
Hmm.
example, and that's probably where the idea of a prompt comes from. If you've heard of prompts in
Yes.
ChatGPT, so prompt was a way to coerce the model into giving the output that you wanted, essentially, because it wasn't trained to do any one particular job. And these models are still available on OpenAI's playground as an API. They call it with different names, Lavinci, Curie, and all of these
Yes.
things. So these are general GPT-3 models that you can use to fine tune for your own specific needs, but you can also use it for doing things like chatbots, etc. Because they will work
Okay.
in those situations as well. They just won't work as well. And
Oh, okay.
what they've done with ChatGPT is that they've added a few things on top of GPT to
Hmm.
train it to specifically to be a chatbot. So if you think about it, ChatGPT is essentially GPT 3.5. They added a point 0.5 because they changed a few things in the GPT model. So it's GPT 3.5 trained specifically to be a chatbot.
Okay.
And there are a couple of very cool things that they added on top of this GPT-3 model to make it work for Chat GPT, which are a couple of things. Number one is that, see, one thing with with GPT-3 was that it was completely unsupervised learning. I mean, it's simply not possible to label all of of the data that they use. I think it was about 40 GB something of textual data,
Okay.
which is a huge amount. You cannot possibly annotate that amount of data.
40
So
GB data.
GPT,
Okay.
yeah. So and for images, that's probably maybe not that much. For text, that's a lot. So they trained it in an unsupervised manner, which means that the data was just input to the system as it was. There was no supervision on top of the data. There was no labeling. There was no tagging. Right. For Chat GPT, they did two things. Number one, they did supervised training on top of the GPT-3 model. So they had labelers, they had contractors write down prompts, the input of the system, and then reply to those prompts. So they had these paired or these annotated sets of textual dialogue essentially, and they fine-tuned the GPT-3 model on top of that. The other cool thing that you might have seen or heard about is the RLHF, which is reinforcement learning with human
Hmm.
feedback, which
Hmm.
is another cool thing. And that's probably the one thing that makes ChatGPT so much better and actually makes it useful. And
Okay.
the idea is borrowed from the general idea of reinforcement learning. So
Hmm.
reinforcement learning is a relatively old concept. It's widely used in robotics to train, let's say, a robotic hand to figure out how to grasp something, right? If you want to train a robotic hand to, let's say, grasp something, label data is of no use anymore. So the idea is that you let the robot interact with the world. So try out random actions. Action would mean, move in this direction and by this much degrees, this much force. So
Hmm.
you try out random actions and you create what is called a reward function. So a reward function is essentially, it says, okay, you did this and this is your reward for this.
Okay.
So your reward can be positive, your reward can be negative as well. And based on the reward, again, the idea with reinforcement learning is that the system tries to optimize the reward that it receives.
Got it.
So the idea is to nudge the system into taking actions that will increase the rewards, right? But
Yes.
it was always assumed that this is something that we can probably use in other fields as well, like language, for example. But the problem is that these goals that they use, these are human created,
Hmm.
and it is not easy to create a goal for every task that you could think of. It's just not conceivable because it's human written, right? So
Yes.
it's very difficult to create these goals for every task. OpenAI essentially did a lot of the research for this technique, RLHF. And what they did was, instead of using explicit goals, they asked humans to grade the performance of a reinforcement learning system. So a reinforcement learning system did something. There was a labeler on hand who said this was a good job or this was a bad job.
Hmm.
And just based on these two feedback, positive feedback and a negative feedback for every action that the system took, they were able to do the same tasks that reinforcement learning did, but in a much shorter time. Then they
Okay.
applied this to language. And the way they applied this to language is that they had different prompts sent to the GPT system. And then they let the model output different answers to the same question, essentially, the same
Okay.
prompt.
Okay.
And then they let the humans evaluate those responses, rank
Okay.
them in order. And that response was used by the GPT system to create more human-like responses to the
Oh,
queries. So supervised fine-tuning is one of the great things that makes it what it is. But then also RLHF is a huge thing that makes it very natural sounding, where you don't have grammatical errors, where you don't have things out of place. That's yeah. So these two things are really, really important for the chat GPT system.
sounds super crazy. So, just to
Yeah.
go back and understand things better,
Yeah.
you said that essentially they gave inputs. You talked about prompts, right? So
Yeah.
people essentially wrote prompts for the chat GPT system, and when they got answers to the prompts, they kind
Yeah.
of ranked the answers. The humans were ranking those answers,
Yeah.
and then they were taking those inputs from the humans and probably, improving the system,
Right.
right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So it must have taken a lot of human labor, like it must have been human intensive while training, or was it not?
Yeah. 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 It was hugely intensive. I think there was a controversy about that as well, because what they also did, because I mentioned supervised training as well, right? So there was a one reason why they did supervised training was also to make sure that the system was not outputting bad results. So there are a few problems with ChatGPT, right? It can sometimes output things that are not factual. It can make things up,
Yes.
but then it can also output toxic content. So to filter
Hmm.
that out, they had to go the supervised route. And the controversy was essentially that there were a lot of, so the company that they use, I think it was a company called Samasource, which is a data labeling company essentially. And their workers in Kenya were tasked with doing this. And a lot of the times what happened was that these people were continuously exposed to really toxic content in the form of language, because they had to either rank them or they had to create
Yeah.
prompts or responses to them. And a lot of this content was toxic. So
Hmm.
you get exposed to that day in day out. It's very, very it's a very bad situation for the people.
Yeah.
And these people are not really paid as much as well, so
Yeah.
they are underpaid as well. So that was a little bit of an issue. But yeah, a lot of effort goes into the human side of the labeling as well.
That's crazy. Yeah. And I heard about, you essentially talked about people in Kenya, like they were given the
Yeah.
job. So essentially, this work is given for say something like YouTube and Facebook Reels, where they have moderators in different companies and they
Mm.
consume that toxic content and they have to filter
Yeah.
it out. Kinds of affects them mental health. Probably we'll see if something like this comes out for this as well in
Yeah.
terms of a news going forward. And you also talked about the fact that 40 GB of text data was fed into the system,
Yeah.
right? And so how much time does it take to like train this sort of model? I think, yeah, it's been 6 years since it's been
Yeah.
into training. So
Yeah.
training is costly and training takes a lot of time. Like
Yeah.
what must be have been the like approximate cost it would have entailed to train such a system and bring it to the world? Like, do you have any idea about that?
So I don't think there's any information put out by OpenAI about that. But for ChatGPT, I think we don't have much information. But we do have information on how much it took to train GPT-3. So I think it would have actually cost them more time and money to train GPT-3, which is the bigger model. ChatGPT is more fine-tuning on top of that, so it probably cost them less. But for GPT-3, there have been some estimates, and I think going by their paper, there were two estimates. One was how much time it took, as you were talking about, which I think it was about 355 GPU years. So essentially, if you were training
Wow.
the entire thing on just one GPU, it would have taken it around 355 years. And it was based on, I think it was based on using the A100 GPU from NVIDIA, which I think is the best one available, or was available when it was trained in 2019. I think GPT-3 came out, or 2028 came out. So based on those calculations, they, as I said, 355 GPU years. Obviously, they were probably using thousands of them. So
Hmm.
it depends on how many they were actually using to reduce the time it took. But it should have taken at least 2 to 3 months to train. And this is just one training run, remember, because
Yeah.
they probably had to do multiple training runs to get this right. And so every one training run based on this 355 GPU years calculation, it would have cost them at least 5 to 6 million.
Wow.
And that's again, see, the thing is, because they were using and they still are using Microsoft Azure compute environment. So we don't know what kind of deal they brokered. They probably were paying less than normal people pay. But even then, I think it would have at least cost them 4 to 5 million per training run, as it was back then. Yeah, so GPT-3 was that, and then on top of that, you have to factor in the cost for actually labeling the data involving the human labelers for ChatGPT. GPT-3 did not involve any supervised learning, so there was no cost for labeling the data, right? But for
Hmm.
ChatGPT, they must have paid a huge amount for the labeling cost as well. And then for the compute, which I'm guessing would at least be around 2 to 3 million. So perhaps if 20, 15 to 20 million would be a fair estimate. Yeah, I think it would have cost them at least that much to train the system.
Right. And is it's 15-20 million for just training this whole system, right? And
Yeah,
from that, I just wanted to understand, let's talk a bit about the people who started out with this initiative, like the
yeah,
OpenAI thing, which is probably Sam Altman, who is the co-founder of Y Combinator. Then there's
yeah,
Peter Thiel, invested in Facebook early on. Then there's Elon
yeah,
Musk, and more people like that, right?
yeah.
So they kind of came together to start OpenAI, right? From your perspective, what must have been the vision? Like, was it to challenge tech companies like Google and probably beating them in their game, or just creating something which is like revolutionary? What would have been the purpose? Because from what I know, that Elon Musk is now no more a part of OpenAI.
Yeah, yeah,
He's left, but yeah, Sam Altman and others are there, right? And they probably well know that Google is going to compete with them, and
right,
it's out with
right.
it's the competitor. So what must have been the motivation or inspiration for them?
Yeah, so the story for OpenAI is it's very interesting. In 2015, OpenAI was founded, and it was a non-profit organization back then. So the stated goal at the time was not to compete with anybody; it was simply to create AGI. That was their stated goal. They wanted to create artificial general intelligence, and the idea with people like Elon Musk and Sam Altman was that AI is going to come in the next decade or 2 decades after that, but it is going to come. And instead of standing on the sidelines and seeing how it evolves and let others take the lead, why not create it ourselves? And we will involve the best minds in AI into this, and we'll create a safe AI essentially. So we'll make sure we'll have policies in place, and we will involve other organizations as well to make sure that this goes in a safe. It doesn't veer off the path. That was the idea in 2015. I think somewhere down the line, they realized that in order to keep the top talent that they had, and because training and inference and all of this, it costs a huge amount of money, they probably needed external investment. And they could not attract external investment or VC funds as long as they were non-profit. So they converted into a for-profit corporation in, I think, 2019, which is when they received around 100 million, I think, from Microsoft as investment. 2018 is when Musk left. I
Yeah.
think that was the time when Tesla was really going all in on AI as well, and they were
Hmm.
trying to build the Tesla robot as well. So I think Musk stated that it would have been a conflict of interest for him if he stayed on, which is the reason he left in 2018. So
Hmm.
yeah, so 2019 they become for profit, and since then their partnership with Microsoft has really deepened. The last month, I think they Microsoft invested around 10 billion into
Yeah.
OpenAI. And the thing with Microsoft is not just the money they're investing is huge, but in return, what they're getting is the underlying model that
Hmm.
OpenAI is creating. Because even though you and I have access to the APIs to the model, we don't actually have access to the model itself. We cannot
Right.
fine tune the model to our requirements. We can't
Yeah.
deploy it on our own systems, right? So we only have an interface to the model, not the model
Correct.
itself. Microsoft has that access with the $10
Oh,
billion
okay.
dollars that they've
Yeah.
invested. So they have access to their IP essentially. So if you've looked into how they've integrated Bing, the ChatGPT like thing into the Bing,
Hmm.
it's not really a conversation
Hmm. Hmm.
kind of interface. It's more of you search for something, you ask it something, and it answers you.
Right.
It's not in a back and forth dialogue kind of manner, right? It's not
Yeah.
really a chatbot. So it's obvious that they've used their model and they've added on top of some layering on top of
Okay.
that to create it. So yeah, that's the story behind it. Interestingly, actually, Infosys was also an early investor into OpenAI. I think back in 2015, Infosys was one of the founding members of
Is it?
yeah, Infosys was a founding
That's
member of
crazy.
of, of OpenAI as well. there were a bunch of people back then. It was AWS was there, Y Combinator was there. You talked about Sam Altman, who's
Yeah,
obviously the CEO. But then there's another great researcher in AI, Ilya Sutskever, whose contribution to AI has been immense. He was also part of the founding team. I'm not sure if he's still there, but he was part of the team as well. So I think the idea back then, and this got everybody excited as well, because this was at the time people didn't know that they were going to be, sorry, for profit, right? So back then
yeah,
it was like whatever research they came out with, they used to open source it. The models were available for public and all of that. So it was pretty exciting. And they still do some of that. Some of their things, some of their models, like they have a speech recognition model called Whisper AI, which is open sourced. So they
yeah.
still do that, but their most prized asset is obviously not available for everybody.
And you talked about Whisper. There's something called as voice AI,
Yeah,
which Elon Musk demonstrated in in a podcast episode with someone, where you can actually get voices of, say, Joe Biden or Donald Trump. So I'm speaking in my own tone, and then
right.
above that, Joe Biden's tone will come, and probably he'll speak my
Yeah, yeah,
language, whatever I'm speaking right now.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that's again open source. Probably you can take the API and use it for your own purposes and stuff like that. And interestingly, I have one more question around when OpenAI started out, like in 2015. Did they ever think that AI is gonna become like intelligent in itself, which means will it ever become sentient, which was a risk associated with, training something like AI, AGI, artificial
yeah,
general intelligence, which happened, I think, when I read about Lambda, which is Google's language model, that one of the developers kind of complained to the execs that it's becoming
yeah,
sentient when it asked the
right.
AI that what do you fear, and the AI said that I fear that you'll turn me off and I will not be able to help anybody. So then he asked
Yeah,
the AI that, do you fear death? And the AI said, yes, I fear death.
yeah.
So not sure if the parameters for sentient or measuring the sentiment of the AI was there at that time. But do you think they ever thought about that this thing, like it's gonna become something like Terminator as they show in the
Yeah.
movies, something like that? Ever?
I think the example that you talked about from Google, that was definitely not sentient AI. Sorry, sentient AI. But yeah, I think definitely these guys, they did think, and they still do that. This is something that we need to be careful about, which I think was the whole idea behind starting this initiative. Because again, remember, in the beginning, it was a non-profit, and it was being run completely by funds or charitable funds. So I don't think they meant to make money from it initially. So yeah, and Musk has been very vocal about the dangers of AI. So I think these guys definitely had an idea, and Sam Altman has also talked about this, I think. So the idea that he proposed, and I agree with that also, is that right now we're nowhere near AGI in terms of the technology. But the thing is that this technology is moving at an exponential rate. So even though
Hmm.
we might be linear right now, in a decade, it could be vastly different to what it is right now. And something that can happen in a decade, we really need to be careful about that, because it can get out of our hands very, very quickly, especially if it gets into the wrong hands. That I think actually, if you look at guys like Google and all of these other big tech companies, they have had these similar models for a few years, but they haven't released anything out for the public to use. That was
Yes.
actually one of the. So I was talking about, in the beginning about ChatGPT, that it wasn't really a research innovation in the sense that it didn't do anything revolutionary. There's also an argument that actually this technology was already available for guys like Google. They just didn't want to release it out there because they thought
Okay.
it was maybe a little bit irresponsible to release something like that
Hmm.
without going deep into what are the ethical considerations of it. Or it could simply be that, because see, for Google, their biggest revenue comes from ads,
Yeah.
and doing something like Chat GPT is going to take away that revenue, a lot of
Yep.
that revenue away, because you're no longer going to search and click on links anymore.
Yes.
So maybe they had another motive for not releasing that. But there are other companies. That there's this company called Anthropic, which Google just invested 300 million in. And
Hmm.
Anthropic is building a similar technology as well. But again, these guys are not releasing. They're very careful on releasing this kind of stuff. So one argument is also that again that the technology has been available to some of the people, but people are being very careful on how to release, which is a good sign. Not everything should be released in open source. Talking about OpenAI being a non-profit and releasing everything, but maybe it's a good thing that stuff like ChatGPT is not available to everybody because it can be mishandled very easily, right?
So, does that also mean that, you're talking about one of the risks, like it can go bad, like there's no guarantee of anything. If something like that happens, like it becomes like sentient or whatever, it becomes really intelligent and stuff like that. Is there a way to turn it off or, just shut it off completely? And then, so there's a possibility, like from your perspective, is there a possibility that Chat GPT may just go away totally if something goes wrong? Like can that happen?
I don't think ChatGPT can do that because the worst that it can do, it doesn't even have the capability to surf the web. The most it can do is it can give you bad information. It can tell you how to make a bomb. And
Yeah,
actually,
yeah.
people have actually tried have figured out how to make ChatGPT do those things. See, as I mentioned, with the supervised learning, what they tried to do was take away what was to stop ChatGPT from outputting these toxic responses, and for the most part it does that. But
Yeah.
people have figured out jailbreaks to coerce the ChatGPT bot into still,
Okay.
so for
Okay.
example, there was this one example where it wasn't going to give you the recipe for making a bomb, but then they asked it to create a movie scene or a movie script where one person doesn't know how to create a bomb and the other person does, and he's teaching him how to create the bomb. And in through that script, they can essentially
Yeah,
take
they
take
trick the
that
system in
information.
a way.
Yeah, yeah.
And from
So
while conversing with you, I have this, I can gauge something that, since Microsoft is investing in Chat GPT and Google is out with the Bard system.
yeah,
Not sure if they're similar in terms of understanding things and models and stuff. Probably you can tell better. But since the competition is heating up so much now that two big giants are there, will it be a possibility that they may just introduce more scenarios beyond GPT, like they're doing in voice, in video, and probably
yeah.
others? And that can trigger like other parties, say governments, and put in restrictions in terms of developing these systems. When they see that
Yeah,
the risks are increasing because of competition, can that also happen, that the governments may come in and do some sort of put restrictions on them?
I think that is government regulation is possible. If you remember, maybe a decade ago or something, 2 decades ago, there was this whole craze of cloning.
Yeah.
People were trying to clone everything, but then there was a mandate on that human cloning is not allowed, not even in experiments. You can't even try to experiment with that, right? And then it all stopped. So there was government regulation on that, and it happened. So it can happen again. I don't think we are in that situation yet, because as I said, these systems right now, even though they're very good at what they do, they don't really have capabilities that can influence you out in the world. They're not even physical, right? And even as a software, they don't really have the capability of getting out of their shell. They can't really interact with systems outside of their purview. They can't even surf the web, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
So that possibility is not there. And I also don't think something like this would happen if you're very careful and you don't give it the means to interact with the world. I don't think there's really any danger, but at some point you are probably going to have to give them the tools to affect the world if you want robots to be out there. Or for example, if you want, because see, ChatGPT is only trained up till what, 2021, so it doesn't have any idea about events after that. But what if you could give it the capability of surfing the web and giving out information that way? Then you would have given it access to surf the web, and that's maybe something that can be a little bit dangerous. But I'm pretty sure that these guys are taking full consideration of that. I think the people who are heading these kind of research, they have an understanding of what things can go wrong, and they are being very, very careful about that.
Hmm.
And but yeah, you were also talking about these guys coming out with other stuff. Yes. So I think last week Google came out with a system called Music LM, which is essentially you can write a text prompt and it creates music for that. So you can, for
Oh.
example, ask it to create a jingle in this particular. You can give it details like it should be happy or it should be sad,
Hmm.
and it should be using a guitar or it should be using a piano. It should be this long, its mood should be like this, and it creates a pretty good
Yeah.
composition, a pretty good music. Again, I think they're being very careful with this. They didn't release any of the code. They didn't release any of the models. They just released a paper on how they achieved it. Google also has another system. I forgot its name. I read about it a month ago, I think. They had been researching on it for about 2 years.
Hmm.
And essentially, what that does is it combines different types of data. So,
Okay.
ChatGPT can only work on text. That
Yeah.
system is supposed to be ChatGPT that can also work on images, and it can
Okay.
also work on videos. So, one of the key things that we talk about with AGI is that with these systems that we currently have, these weak AI systems, they don't have knowledge. They only have specific knowledge about a specific task, but they don't have a central concept of knowledge that they can apply to other things, which is why
Okay.
they cannot reason, which is why they cannot learn new tasks, right? They don't have a central concept of what it means to understand the concept.
All
So
right.
the idea with that model that Google is creating is to have a central knowledge center that is not dependent on any mode of data. So it doesn't
Okay.
directly come from text, it doesn't directly come from images, it doesn't directly come from sound. So if
Okay.
it has a concept of a cat, that concept of a cat is shared when you speak to it. So it understands when you say cat, it understands that it's the same concept as looking at a cat in an image, and it's the
Oh,
same concept of a cat as written in text. So it has a
damn.
central concept of things in the world, and then it relates it to different types of data. And I think the idea there is very scary because that's
Yeah.
really varying on the AGI. That's the one thing that current systems don't have. If it's a
Yes.
system based on images, it can't really understand text. If you take that away, then automatically the concept of understanding and knowledge comes into existence because it doesn't necessarily depend on one kind of data. I think that they're still quite a bit far away from that. They released a paper, I think, last year. So we're not
Hmm.
really sure how far they are. But the fact that they are working on it at all, they have a significant amount of resources dedicated to
Damn.
this thing, means that things are going to change very quickly whenever it comes into existence.
Which essentially means that the system is going to have a brain of a sorts,
Right.
like a
Yeah.
human brain. And we read about, I studied about neural networks. It's like the shape of a brain, like they have neurons and stuff. So
Yeah.
probably it's gonna have a brain of its own and it's gonna threaten, firstly, the jobs, right? Or the skill set which is currently there. So my next question was around that only. Like, what kind of skill set should like people focus on now or in the future, since the job market is getting disrupted by such models like Google Bard and Chat GPT. Essentially, it's like
Yeah.
content writers are getting affected a lot right now. Script writers are getting affected a lot right now. So, what kind of new skill set or what kind of new thinking would people need to, just go through this wave and probably use it, utilize it to their benefit from your
Yeah.
perspective?
I think at least right now the jobs themselves won't be affected. I think what will be affected is how those jobs are done. Because when everybody starts using the same tools, the expectation of what the quality content is will also change. I think right now you can write something. See, for example, 20 years ago, if you could write pretty much anything on a blog and it would still be valuable. Today, that's not the case because
Yeah.
writing a blog and putting it up is very, very easy. So now you have to really put out really good content,
Yeah.
very well thought out content to make it stand out. I think it's going to be the same with this kind of AI as well, because now everybody will have access to good content. They will have access to maybe fresh ideas. So then it will become about how you come up with fresh ideas and how you present it, things
Yeah.
that you can't do with an AI currently. And that will
Hmm.
keep changing because new things are going to be available with AI every 3-4 years, and you're going to reevaluate how to do it. So it's a very in some ways it's difficult, especially if you're in the content business, because you have to constantly keep finding new ways of creating content and
Yeah.
fresh content so that you can still keep standing out from others. But yeah, as I said, I think this will just be a tool that people use to create content or to do anything. Even for example, for you can do a lot of coding with this kind of AI, but it cannot replace a programmer, because number
Yeah.
one, you're not sure that it's writing the right code. You still need somebody to
Hmm.
test the code, number one.
Yep.
And number two, is not going to write the entire thing.
Correct.
What you can use it as is an assistant. If you hire an assistant, you're not going to fire other people. You're still going to, you still need those people. So it's going to be, there was this very cool tweet saw, which was what they said was what they see AGI in future is having these agents in the cloud that you can hire at any time to do any job. So if you
Okay.
want, for example, 5 backend developers, you can just hire
Yeah.
them off the
Yeah.
AGI cloud for a specific amount of time and pay them like a utility.
That's a
So
crazy idea, in
that's
fact,
yeah. But then what do backend developers do? So
Yes.
what new skill sets do you acquire? That's not clear. I think this is something that will evolve as more and more things come out.
And I always go back to the fact that India is doing this and that, and say crypto, we were doing so much, still doing so much,
Yeah.
but regulations are there. So what do you think about India? I think you talked about India in the last podcast as well. Is India going to play it big over here again, like in terms of, because you have such a large developer base and engineers and
Yeah.
stuff? Do you think it's going to happen?
Yeah, I think in fact in the recent budget they came out with this proposal for data governance, where I think what they're doing is because Common collects a lot of data, right, in all different formats. So what they're going to do is they're going to make all of that available data available to startups, I think for free or maybe
Okay.
a small amount, and
Oh,
it's going to
nice.
be anonymized as well. So no privacy issues. So for example, demographic data and maybe some image-based data sets as well. Probably not image-based because that will image too much, reveal too much of information, but definitely demographic data and textual data about conversations and all of
Yeah.
that. It's going to make it available to starters for free. And
Wow. It's
so
crazy.
that's really good. So it's obvious that the government is really putting a focus on AI. It's
Hmm.
trying to create an AI ecosystem, which is very good news, because I think right now, if you look at the AI ecosystem, the US is obviously far ahead of everybody else.
Yeah.
Just behind them is China. We're doing a lot
Okay.
of investment in that as well. So obviously, if you want to be a superpower in the next 10, 20 years, if you want to be up there, you have to invest in AI.
Yes.
And nobody's going to lend that information to you. Nobody's going to lend that expertise to you, which means that you have to develop it in-house. You have to have your
Yes.
own research institutes doing the kind of research that you need to develop these systems. So it is super important. I think the government recognizes it too. But I think we have a lack of talent, because I think what happens a lot of the times is the people who are the most
Hmm.
talented usually end up going abroad, which is what happens, which is what's been happening for a long time. But it's still true, right? The most talented people, they go abroad
Yep.
because the biggest companies, the biggest job market is out in the West. So
Yep.
we lose out a lot of talent in that, and I think talent is maybe the biggest issue for AI in India.
Hmm.
Um, because there is money, there are a lot of startups working in this field, but I don't think there's enough talent to really develop systems that again will work. Maybe a little bit of lack of funding is also the issue, because as I mentioned,
Yep.
ultimately uh, startups in AI are expensive because you need to
Yep.
spend money on data. And even if you can even if you can learn the techniques required to do all of the things and not spend much on the talent side of it, you're still in money to invest on the data side of things, which you can't really escape. Uh,
True.
so the investment is an issue right now, but I think with ChatGPT, what is I think is going to happen is people are going to realize that there is a real potential here. So maybe there is going to be an increase in the amount of funding that is given to AI startups, which I think will really help.
I supposedly it will, like, the funding will definitely should increase, because there's so much potential and there's so much happening in the world. From that, I think there's an interesting question which kind of popped into my mind is interesting products around AI, like, which exist right now. One is definitely like ChatGPT is there. Google Bard is
Yeah,
coming in a few days, and then there are some other cases and products which you might have stumbled upon in your
yeah.
research probably. So any interesting stuff from your side which you've stumbled upon in AI?
Yeah, there are a lot of interesting things that see, again, as I mentioned, you don't see a lot of AI out in the world because there are not killer apps around it, but they are being used internally by a lot of companies. So for example, lidar is used in autonomous driving, right? But apart from that, there are a lot of use cases that people have been doing. One of the use case, for example, has been for smart city planning. I think a few cities in the Netherlands and the US have started. What they started doing is they put this lidar on top of a traffic light, and they monitor the traffic in real time using lidar. And what they're able to do with that is track people, track movements, and track cars, and essentially figure out which how they would organize the traffic better so that the traffic is smoother. Or for example, small things like how long should the green light be on, or how long should the red light be on at specific times of day to make sure that the traffic flow is smoother.
Yeah.
So that's one interesting aspect of it. Using lidar, there's another growing field which is mining using lidar. So what happens is when you're mining for coal or for resources,
Okay.
you're so far down in the earth that there's no GPS. um, there's very little communication, and it's very dangerous to put people out there and go inside and check out the
Hmm.
mines. So what they do is they put small lidars on top of drones, and they let the drone fly itself autonomously within the mines, again because the communication is an issue, so you can't have
Yeah.
somebody controlling it. So an autonomous drone in this scenario makes so much sense because it can save lives,
Correct.
and
Yes.
it can map out the entire mine, because again, you can't use cameras in this scenario because it's deep down inside the mine and you probably don't have lights there. So
Yeah.
it's dark, you can't use cameras, but lidar can still be effective. So you map out the entire
Wow.
mine, and because you can get the exact shape of the mine, you can figure out the terrain exactly, and then you can build your tools to properly do mining in that area. Or you could
Superb.
also use lidar in a similar way, like using lidar on top of a drone. You could use it to analyze constructions, construction of buildings, construction of bridges. If you build a bridge and you want to check the underside of the bridge, it's a difficult thing to do manually.
Right.
But you can have a drone and you can use the lidar to map the entire structure, and then you can
Hmm.
figure out structure issues with that. So there's lots of uses in there. There's lots of uses in the medical industry. There was recently this paper put out by, I think, Columbia or some institution which used GPT-3 to analyze notes written by doctors for patients. And the idea was that if a patient returns back to you after, let's say, 2 months, 3 months, you don't have to go through his notes and figure out what his issues were 3 months ago. You
Got
can
it.
simply ask GPT about it, and it will give you like a concise
Yeah.
explanation of what happened. So there's so many use cases in the and this is a thing that I presented in a recent conference as well, which is what we call the long tail problem
Mm-hmm.
in AI, which is that a lot or most of the value, 90% of the value in AI is created by a very small number of use cases, like speech recognition, like
Yeah.
facial recognition, like ChatGPT.
Hmm.
And most of the value is created by these small use cases.
Right.
And because these are so valuable, there's a lot of research into it. And you
Got
can
it.
find open source models, you can find research around it. It's easier to develop things around it, and that
Yes.
kind of snowballs into it. You have research easily available, so you start developing things into that frame. But really, in the industry, people are trying to do things that don't really fall into that category. Like 90% of the use cases don't fall in these use cases. So individually,
Hmm.
their values are very low. The business value they create is very low, but they are widely used. Like for example, in the medical AI, there's no killer app
Right.
in medical AI. There's no big thing in medical AI. But it's
Correct.
not that people are not doing it. It's just that there are many different use cases with
Yeah.
smaller values. So these are medical use cases. These are, as I mentioned, mining use cases. There's a lot of use cases for AI in port shipping. So, for example, counting the number of containers that you have,
Hmm.
or in logistics as well, how to figure out the best way to package something in a small amount of area. That's one area of research as well. There's use cases for pre-screening certain kind of diseases using X-rays and MRIs, and I've also seen use cases in dental where you can map your dental structure,
Yeah.
and you can create better devices for that. So
Crazy.
there's lots and lots of use cases, but they are smaller ones, so we don't really hear about them much.
In fact, just to add in, I have some fitness use cases as well, where the apps, they track your movements and give you feedback on your form, or give you a score.
Yeah,
So you have to train the model first. So kind of working on it earlier, but yeah, there are
yeah,
some hurdles definitely, as you said. We need more development in that front. So before we close this, I just want to from your perspective, since Google is here with Bard and ChatGPT, I keep repeating this,
Yeah.
that who is going to win this among the two, like ChatGPT or Google? Like, that's the closing question.
But ChatGPT, I don't think ChatGPT alone would have been able to beat Google. But now that they are integrated with Microsoft, they do have a chance. I think if Google really goes all in on it, I think it will still win because it has a much wider reach than Microsoft has through its search engine. The problem is, I'm not sure how it's going to reconcile that with the business model that it currently has in terms of ads from search, because that is, I think, maybe 60-70% of its revenue. So if they do include something like that, it's 100% it's going to drive down the amount of times that people click on links when you search for something. And if you click a fewer times, that means people are not going to be that much interested in advertising on that, which means that their revenues are going to drive down. But they
Yeah.
also have to respond to this chat GPT. So they have to come up with an alternative. So it's, I'm not really sure how they'll deal with the revenue side of things. And that's why they might be a little careful on not really releasing every possible capability that they have. But if they did, I'm pretty sure they would beat them because they have a much wider reach. So it'll be interesting how they balance that with the revenue side.
Yeah, they may also work on AI generated ads based on the prompts, probably.
Mm.
So
So
that,
their ads, I think, already are using AI.
yeah.
Interestingly, search. So we talked about transformers, right? In 2017, Google came up with transformers. In 2018, they released a model called BERT, which was the first large language model.
Okay. Yeah, port. Yeah.
And Google search has been using that for a while. We just didn't realize it. But
Yeah.
it's been using Bird. See, earlier, 5-6 years ago, if you typed in something, what Google was searching for was just the terms, the main terms in your search query. It
Search
wasn't
query.
searching
Yes.
for propositions like for, in, and all of these things.
Correct.
Now with BERT, it uses that information to precisely figure out what you want to. So it treats it like a natural language.
Natural
Whereas
language. Yes.
earlier it was treating it like a bunch of queries, a bunch of terms, different terms that didn't really relate to each other. So it has
Crazy.
been using BERT, but again, see, that's the thing. Like it's been using BERT, we don't even know about it. So maybe it'll find a way to use something like ChatGPT without
Yes.
interfering with their ads business.
Yes. Let's see what happens in this world of AI. I think
Yeah.
development is going at a crazy pace, and I'm excited about it. Hopefully, you are too, because you're already in the AI world. So, man, I think this was a very interesting conversation I've had with you the second time, and this was way deeper. And
Yeah.
I still have so many questions in my brain. I'll definitely ask you these questions in another episode, definitely, when we connect
Yeah.
and discuss more about the next level of AI, which is going to come sooner than we expect when Google is coming out with Bard and ChatGPT is there. So the
Yeah.
war is going to continue and the conversations are going to continue as well at the same time. Shikhar, thanks for connecting, bro. It was amazing having you here again on the podcast. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me, man. Such a good conversation.
Thanks, brother. See you soon.
See you soon, man.
Cheers.